Continuing on to chapter Reish Tzadik Hey, which is on page Tavkuf Tzadik Vav 596 in the first volume of Ayin Beis. So we're continuing discussion of the difference of the Bittul, which is talking about the different levels of how the Yesh, the ego, the identity and personality of existence is sublimated into the divine, how much it senses itself and how much it senses that source, the source above it. So the distinction generally is between the Ur and Keli, between the energy and the container. And of course, he's talking about where these two meet, which is the inner container meets the energy. So in the previous chapters, he's been discussing Samenu Kidmusenu, the two levels of Tselem and Mus, the image and shape of the human being shaped in the image of the divine. And that reflects the two dimensions of this type of bittul, this type of sublimation. So in the previous chapter 294, we discussed that a few key points. That number one is that the containers of Atzilus, even the Yechudi Allah, their higher sense, that they sense that there's nothing but the divine, that is in the form of hiskalilus. That's because they're submerged in energy. It's not because they have that in their inherent personality, the containers, that is. The energy has that, because energy is an extension of its source. Light reflects its source. A container is a personality, is an identity. It's not reflecting the source. Its primary function is its own personal identity. But since it's submerged, since it's hiskalilus, since it's a container to the energy, therefore it assumes and senses that type of bittul. But it's like a chacham katan, a scholar, in the presence of a greater scholar, where he actually is affected and stands humbled by the greater scholar, but it doesn't mean he doesn't exist. Okay. So it's a diminishing of his being. Then he goes on to say that the container, even though it's still not its own personality, but it becomes similar, mizdama elayir, it becomes similar and assumes that personality. And he goes further and says that you have to say that the container itself also has a form of bittul. But that's already a lower level of bittul, bittul hayesh. Because the fact the container itself is a receptacle and ready to receive, that's what makes it capable to connect to the energy and its higher level of bittul. So essentially the container is yichud tata, the lower level of unity, bittul hayesh, and the energy is yichud ilah, but the container on its own has that inherently in its own personality. And naveda, that's the idea of praying kevid reish, where you break your desires for worldly things and for foreign matters in order to be a container to receive the divine contemplation. And now, the final point is in that chapter in Reish Tzadik Dalet is that just as the container goes out of its own nature is its own personality, to receive and to absorb the energy, so that causes the energy also to go out of its own nature, which is to remain ayin, to remain connected to its source, and to descend into this container, because the energy senses the purpose, the kavanah el-yena, the higher purpose that the containers that is wedged in the container. So the container, in a sense, is a catalyst that reminds the energy when it has that bittul of receiving the energy, that the energy should descend and be drawn into the containers. And this, in many ways, is deeper than the bittul that energy has on its own. Okay. So now we continue to 295. And this chapter is going to say the opposite now. Just like we said before, that the energy has a higher level of sublimation than the container does, but the container, in turn, has its own level of receptivity, its own bittul, in order to receive, and that awakens inside the energy the recognition of the higher purpose that it has to descend. So he says, now, Omnam tzarech la'imer, however, we have to say, Sha'er metzadatzmei, that the energy on its own, Hainu kedem, Hainu gam kedem achanas akli, even before the container achanas akli, in other words, before the container prepares the ground. So before we said, like the organs, when they're healthy, they draw in their energy. That's why when, God forbid, an organ is damaged or wounded, energy expires from it. When you heal it, it draws it in. So in other words, it's the container that is drawing in the energy downward, whereas the energy on its own, its nature is to return to its source, or to be connected to its source. So he's saying, but we have to say that also even before the achanas akli, now it's even before the preparatory, the conduciveness that the container creates, it also has this bittul, this selflessness to descend below. Because till now we were saying that the energy doesn't have that on its own. That's what the container, in a sense, awakens in it, and almost like causes it to go against its nature. So he's saying, just like the container has, even though its nature's its identity, not yesh, and still has within it the ability to receive, the even though its identity is ayin, also has within it a sense that it has to, and a bittul that it has to also descend. So because that's the whole concept of energy or in the first place. Why do we have Because it's a revelation and a drawing down from Atzmus, from the source, in order to illuminate. So if was completely defined by its desire to be included in the source, it wouldn't be illuminating. The mere fact that it's illuminating and revealing means it has that bittul to know that's what its purpose is. So in other words, what he's saying here is now adding a very critical dimension here. Remember, in the interface, we have to have this symbiotic, we have to have this perfect connection between above and below, between yesh and ayin, between self and that which is beyond the self, the divine. If somewhere there's a broken link and it's not complete, there's going to be a missing element in the integration. So we need two opposites here all the time. We need to have something as personality. We don't want to annihilate existence. On the other hand, we don't want to compromise the divine. So if the does not have any sense that it has to go below, and it's completely being compelled and coerced to do so, so in a way you're compromising the divine. The fact is, by its mere nature, has the awareness that it has to shine outward. Like the sunlight. Sunlight knows it's going outside of the sun. So the on its own has that sense. However, obviously the container is what really seals the deal, that it should be contained within existence. But is not completely resistant to the whole concept. It does know that its purpose is to reveal. And the same thing with the container. Even though its purpose is to define the parameters of existence, it also has an element of receptivity. Take away those two elements that I just described, and Eir and Keli will not be able to really meet in a peaceful way. It'll be a battle. And we don't want a battle. It may begin with a battle, but we want to have a harmonious unity here between the two. And now he asks a question. Not a question. He explains. The commotion is the beginning of this whole section of Ayin Beis. He explained before in chapter 128. She has Beis mini Giluyim, the Ein Sof Baruch Hu. There are two types of revelations of the divine infinite light. One, b'chinas Gilia Atzmus. One is to reveal Atzmus, to reveal the essence. This too is only a reflection. But this is how Atzmus is revealing himself, revealing energy, revealing light, according to the commensurate to what Atzmus is like. So in other words, it's not shaped or defined by anything but Atzmus. It's a revelation of Atzmus and expressing that Atzmus, the essence. Va'beis, in the second revelation, is because Gili min ha'etzem, is a revelation from the essence, shaloi lefi eifan Atzmus, that is not similar to and reflective of exactly the personality of Atzmus. This second energy is tailored according to the parameters and structure of existence of the worlds that has midah v'gvul, that's defined. So you have the two types of energy flowing from outside of Atzmus. Why is the second? What's the purpose of the second energy? Because the purpose of the second one is in order to radiate and to illuminate to the worlds. So therefore we must say that the air energy has in it an element of descent. Now, what does he speak? You could say there's two ways. You could say speaking both forms of energy have an element of descent, because even the first one that is revealing Atzmus, however, it is a revelation. But especially the second energy, which is actually tailored to the parameters of existence, so clearly has in it already, before it even meets container, the energy itself has a form of has the sense of that needs to descend. And the Inyan in this is he's explaining it now. That energy, light, even though it's on the level of cleaving to its source, and it's in state of elevation and submergence. In other words, energy by nature is always rising and returning to its source and wants to be included, encompassed in its source. Nevertheless, the way it is drawn, the way that energy is transmitted, is in a form it's capable of manifesting in a container. And then it's possible for the container to draw the energy. In other words, if the energy before it met the container was not capable of entering into the container, it would not have been able to be drawn by the container. In the beginning of the discourse of Ayin Beis, he explained the difference between Er Pnimi and Er Makif. That Er Makif, like Rotzen, desire, doesn't have any particular container where it rests. The will, desire, was the desire to look at something, the desire to eat, the desire to walk, the desire to talk, the desire to think, the desire to feel. So there, the energy initially doesn't even have in it the capacity to enter into a container. It's a different personality. It's like he says here, Gili It's the fiha etzem. It's expressing the desire of the soul. However, pnimi is an energy, the energy to see. The difference between a body and a soul, that you have eyes, and the soul has the capacity, the power to see something. That energy has in it, even before it enters the eye, the capacity, the awareness that it is a pnimi, an internalized type of energy that is going to enter into an eye. Now, God forbid if the eye is closed, but God forbid the eye is damaged. That doesn't mean the energy, that just means energy doesn't have a place to manifest. But it is completely defined by that container. So it's not just that the container creates the vision, it's also the energy that goes with the container that has in it the power to see. The same thing with the other faculties. So you have to say that, in other words, the herb, even before it enters the keli, has the capacity and the awareness that it's entering into the keli, so it's already a different type of energy in that sense. It's still by personality drawn to its source and connected to its source, but its form of extension, form of expression, is such that it's prepared to enter into the container and manifest, and that's why the container can have an effect on it.
You still say it has the equality void.
Like, for example, I'm sorry?
It still has equality void, Bittul?
Yeah, because it's, at the end of the day, it's still energy, it's still light, you know. Let's take sunlight, for example. Sunlight is a good example of the first type. Sunlight has no relationship with containers. It shines equally on a pile of garbage and in a palace. So it makes no difference what container is not going to draw more sunlight or less sunlight. I mean, listen, there are obviously things on Earth that grow through the sun, and some things are repel the sun. That's not what I'm talking about. But the sunlight itself, the light, is an all equalizer. It just shines. So you can't say that light is prepared to enter into a container, whereas the light of the soul, the energy of the soul, actually manifests in each of the organs. It's pnimi. And as such, even before it manifests in the organs and the limbs and the faculties, it already has in it conducive. The energy that's going to give a person sight is different energy than the energy that's going to give a person the ability to hear. And then once the container is there, the container will define and actually draw that energy into itself. Now, so if you're able to look at a soul before it, so to speak, manifests inside of our faculties, you wouldn't be able to see this, because the soul is a nebulous form of energy that doesn't have shape and form. But the fact that it does manifest that way, we recognize, therefore, that the soul must have, not made up of parts, but the soul has a type of energy that is tailored to the container that it's going to enter into. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because if the energy was in a form that it could not manifest, it could not dress up in containers, the container would never have been able to at all draw down. It's only because its general hamshacha, its general transmission, is in a form that is capable of being manifest in containers. And now in the parentheses, he qualifies this. Even though we discussed and learned that the containers of Tayu, the world of chaos, of Tayu, they draw down an energy that's higher than the energy that's able to be contained in containers, and that's why it causes the breaking of the containers. So he answers this by saying, that's because these containers were flawed. Not because because the containers are not containers that have the capacity to contain. And the effect of the transmission, there's no form that this caused specifically that there should be the breakage of the containers. So in other words, what he's saying is like this. One second. We just said that if the energy itself was not conducive, was not prepared, even before it is contained, to enter into the container could not draw it down. So, but in Tayu we see it does. The container draws down energy that's beyond its capacity. So he says, well, that's because the containers also are not healthy containers. In other words, the containers themselves are dysfunctional, and not really prepared to contain. So there you have both problems. The containers are not really the right containers. The energy is beyond the containers. And that's causes, of course, that the extension of the energy causes the shvira. Like we learned earlier in chapter 249. Yeah. Well, he's not really talking about makif here. He's talking only pinimi here. I'm just using that as a contrast.
He says there's two revelations.
Correct. But that was just an example to the whole concept here. But he's discussing here is our pinimi. This thing with the Kalim de Tayu needs some more explanation.
I thought that was the next question. Keep the one experience the most. When you're unable to receive, what do you bring out in the other person?
No, because he's saying that the Tayu, the problem is because the containers are flawed. The containers are not really containers to receive. But the energy is an energy that's ready to enter into Tayu. The flaw is only on the containers.
Doesn't say. He says
the flaw is on both ends.
Wow.
So in Tikkun, 1 second. So in Tikkun, the is such that even before it's able to listen, that's why it can be drawn down because of the container, because the itself is that way. Okay. Bottom line is, it's not so I'm 100% clear about this, but the question I'm asking really is this. Does he saying that the energy in Tayu is commensurate to the container and just the container is the problem and therefore it's drawing down an air that doesn't belong there?
And the aura what's the aura has a basic problem?
Because there's the air ha-chochma, air ha-bina in Tayu. There's a problem only the containers, also the problem the air. Well, this goes back to the whole discussion earlier and also how he's going to conclude this whole subject, is that the problem in Tayu is both the air and the keli. That's the truth. That's what he discusses. The air is a problem because the air, they don't tolerate one another, and the kelim, there's no give and take.
There's no bittul in the aura.
So, but here he's focusing on the fact that the container, there's no give and take. Okay, we have to look at Perik Reish test. Let me see that a second. Okay, there he says that the containers are there just to receive for themselves and not to transmit. Okay, fine. After the parentheses, he goes now back to the thing. And this is the inyan. This is the meaning of when you say that the energy is ma'ayin liyesh. It goes from nothingness, from its state of substanceless state, liyesh, to a substance state, in its general transmission. He adds in the parentheses, like it says elsewhere, the that in general, the extension, the transmission of energy, of light, is ma'ayin liyesh. It's traveling from a state of less substance to a state of more substance. Even we're talking about the general revelation of the kav itself, which is the first revelation after the tzimtzum, the thin ray of light. So in other words, the mere fact that energy exists, you're already talking about that it is sensing. It's a journey from a less substance place to a more substance place. Ayin liyesh, relatively speaking, on the level of the earth. And like you said before, so therefore the energy has that, and the container seals the deal. Once the energy has it, the container is able to draw it down completely. And this too, he's now explaining, where does this come from? If light by its nature wants to be included, encompassed in its source, where does it come from? Because this is the bittul to the kavon al yena, to the higher purpose that the energy senses. That its transmission should be according to what its source wants. It should be according to the kavana, the purpose of the source. So he's going to explain the distinction. So now, why does he say gam? Because before he said that the container is the one that evokes the energy to sense the kavan al yena. Because in the container is wedged, not b'tchilas and b'seifan, in the containers is wedged the purpose that you have to manifest in the parameters of existence. Now he's adding in this chapter that the eir also has a sense of that, even prior to the container awakening in it that awareness. Nevertheless, the energy still has within it its primary dominant feature, hischabrus, is more than primary dominance. Hischabrus, the dominated, hischabrus literally means overpowering. Its overpowering feature is is to elevate and to be encompassed in its source according to its fundamental nature.
Fundamental. Hischabrus here is fundamental.
Tive atzmi. Its essential nature.
What hiskalilus means?
I just said, its dominant feature, its overpowering feature. Mm-hmm. Even though the energy senses the kavon al yena, the higher purpose, that it has to descend and go from ayin to yesh, but its dominating and its overpowering feature, however, remains its nature to connect to include, encompassed in its source. And it's through the container that it feels the higher purpose. And it's because of the container that it senses the higher purpose to become in the level of a yesh, which is a descent and being drawn down. And this is a deeper bittul than the one that it has on its own. So, bottom line is like this. The eir has an element of that type of sense, of the higher purpose. You can explain that simply because the eir is bottled to the source. So here you have the catch-22. Since it's buttled to the source, and the source wants a world, the universe, like you said, the second that form of energy is created in order to in order to create this universe. So the energy has to sense what its source is. Remember, at the end of the day, it doesn't have its own agenda.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk about its personality, so in other words, the earth has like two opposite personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Its real personality is dedicated to its source. But since the source says go down, so it has that sense it has to go down. But its primary personality is I'm going because I'm dedicated to you, not because I want to go, not because my identity is to go become a yesh. So never becomes yesh. That's the key distinction. So the remains always but it's of atmos. It's not. It's not a loose cannon. It's not it didn't go off the reservation. It's fulfilling its purpose. So it fills the kavan al yain. But it's not because the has to retain its personality because it has to continuously reflect what God wants. Part of that is going to kavan al yain. So those primary overpowering feature, meaning that's its dominant feature, is its bittul. It's ayin.
But it comes down even before it feels a kid.
Yeah, because that's what the source is telling it to do. Because it knows that.
Right. So why do we say that the dominant features that it's
because even when it's coming down, that's only because the source is telling it to. Its feature is simply to follow whatever the source says. So that's part of what it is, but it remains an agent of the source. It never becomes an identity. Was never sent to become a yesh. If it was, then you don't need air. Then that's the container.
Comes out its yeshus, it's bittul, and its essential nature is its yeshus because it's
essential nature. It's its ayin. That's the thing. Its essential nature is ayin, not yesh.
But that's what's not.
The keli is essential nature is yesh. That's a distinction.
Yes.
Well, so let's make this clear. A container is yesh. Its identity, personality. That's what it was created for.
Yeah.
Hold on. Yet it has also in it an element of ayin that is receptive to the energy. So what we discussed in the previous chapter. Not just is something greater, and it contains it. And it's ready to contain it. And it prepares itself to contain it. It's just like you spoke about, a container receptacle.
Yeah.
The inner container, it's shaped that way.
Mm-hmm.
But its personality, even when it's containing, its personality is still identity. But an identity that contains. Or is the opposite. Its personality is ayin, no identity. All it is a reflection of the source. But the source wants it to go down, so it senses the higher purpose that it has to go into a container. But its dominant feature is ayin. I mean, what's the problem?
Which one is it? I mean, it's dominant. It's ayin. So
dominant feature is ayin. Period. No qualifications.
Therefore, it doesn't need to sense what the.
It does sense because that's why it's there. It's there to reveal.
In other words, its ayin gives it the ability to sense its mokor, and therefore it comes down.
Correct. Yeah.
And the fact that the ayin by nature, as it's described here,
the ayin by nature is always to go back to its source, to be dedicated and to be an extension of its source.
And when does that express itself?
What?
When does that express itself?
That's always. The whole thing, it always remains that way. The air is always restless, always looking to go back to its source.
Always restless, right? We read that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's everywhere. The air is always retaining bittul. Mm-hmm. That's why the air brings bittul into the world. If the air became yesh, we would never have the transcendence within our beings to want to go upward.
In other words, if the oil was always buttled, lots on alien to be the mata mamish only.
No, it's buttled. It's buttled. But its personality is to remain ayin. Is to remain ayin.
Not to be separate from
the they are kli who shenugis by a kavan eliyas b'chinas yed b'chinas shows up b'chinas bittul yesmakei. And this
makes Ratzon true.
Yeah, but he doesn't say that here, so he's not discussing that. So it's the container that causes it to really feel powerfully that sense of the kavan al yena, to come down and to draw down. And this bittul that the container causes the energy to go down is deeper than the bittul that it has beforehand.
It brings it out.
Yeah, it's a deeper bittul. In other words, without the container causes the air to have even a deeper bittul than the air has on its own, even on its own to draw down. And now he's like summing it up. And after all of this is what we have now is the fusion, the union, the joining of energy and container. V'nimtza, hischabrus eres v'kelim hu ayidei shemachlifim tivam. Now he's summing up this whole discussion that began in chapter begin. I lost the place. When he began about Pnimis HaKelim, here. Chapter Reish Pei Dalet. We're now like 11 chapters later. So there's the whole chapter 284 where he talked about how air and Kelim meet. And to explain this, he went into the whole discussion of the inner and outer container. So now he's summing up what he said at the end of 284. So this is a vital piece here. Okay. So it says, so we see from this we know, from this we emerges. The hischabrus eres v'kelim, that the fusion and union, joining of the containers, of the energy in the containers, where they shemachlifim tivam, is through the fact that they replace each other's nature. They change, interchange. We said a word, exchange. They exchange each shemachlifim tivam, that they change their natures. Shakelu b'chinas bittul miyesh la'ayin, that the container is in a state of bittul, of sublimation, of subjugating itself from yesh, from personality, to ayin, to lack of substance. Va'er bo ma'ayin liyesh. And the air it changes its personality. And from ayin, from selflessness, from substanceless to substance. The be'emes hakol b'chinas bittul. In truth, all this is a form of bittul. Because as soon as something goes against its own nature, it defies its own personality, that's already a level of bittul. Bittul meaning doing something not the way you naturally would choose to do. For huyin hiskalilus hischabrus v'akeli ayidei b'chinas habittul shlem liyas kol echad heipach tivei. And this is the inyan, this is the idea of hiskalilus hischabrus v'akeli, the interconnectivity and joint and union of energy and container through their bittul, both of their bittul. Liyas kol echad heipach tivei. That each one is acting and behaving opposite of its natural nature. Where personality and identity of container is assuming a property of receptivity to ayin and receiving that state of ayin, of that state of substanceless, and the energy, who by nature is to be connected all the time and elevate into its source, is being drawn into the container, into the yesh. The Yuvan Pia now, and according to what we learned before, we understand how this actually has two types of interconnectivity. Like in the general interconnectivity of the 10 spheres, there are two elements in it. What is the first type of hiskalilus? That every faculty, every emotion, has within it an opposite emotion. This is in general a weakening of the energy because it has within it the opposite. So chesed, which is love, has within itself also the ability of restraint. Love on its own would just be extending itself forever, without any seasoning, without any containment. And Gvura, but it has Gvura in it, so Gvura causes an opposite. So it's a weakening of the original just love on its own, where it's completely, I don't know, it's selfish, but love on its own has no, it would just continue like rain would continue to pour until it flooded everything. So it's a weakening of the original, of the energy, the Chalal in general. Gam ma sheyesh bo, yesh b'chinas Gvura b'chesed v'chesed b'Gvura. So there's two elements in this first hiskalilus. One is the weakening of one because it hasn't the other, and then there's the general. Then there's of course this actual thing that chesed has within it Gvura, and chesed with Gvura, and there's chesed within, there's Gvura within chesed, and there's chesed within Gvura. He's going back to the original discussion. If you remember the difference between eris and kalim, between energy and container in Tohu, suffered from two problems. The energies did not tolerate one another, and the containers would not allow for a give and take, for a relationship. And that's why in Tikkun, the first thing you need to do is the tolerance. So the energy has to get weaker. The energy is its full intensity, it won't tolerate, like the students of Rabbi Akiva. But that's still not enough. That's like a mediation where the two people who are out with each other agree to just not yell at each other, to just tolerate each other, sit in the same room, listen. But then comes stage two. Once you have that stage set, that there's a tolerance and there's a weakening of that intensity, that you're not both 100% absolutely right. Then comes the second stage where you can actually have the scholars that he's going to talk about, where there's harmony is built. But you can't build that harmony without the first one. So that's what, and Tohu suffers from these both problems, and Tikkun corrects both these problems. It creates tolerance. The air has Bittul, and the Kalim have Bittul. So that's what he's saying now, that when he's talking about how air and Kalim meet, he's going back now and explaining this connection. So in this first hiskalilus itself, he broke it into two parts. One is the weakening in general, that chesed is not just complete pure chesed, it has something else. And then there's the actual hiskalilus that chesed has within it Gvura, and Gvura has within it chesed. Okay. That's the first one.
This was like the mushal we had where the person was punished, he had a certain amount of Gvura, a certain amount of chesed, that the chesed was paid off in this world, and the Gvura to avoid Gvura in the next world. So our things are,
I don't know,
working together. This was in the early talking about this hischabrus of meet us together. Before they were since time to work together, they talked about one tolerating the other, and brought the mushal of the person that would be punished, but they were going to pay off the chesed.
Yeah. This is a continuation. He's going back to that.
Yeah.
Then comes Beis. Beis, the second dimension of hiskalilus. Mashim mekablim zemezeh. They receive from one another. Shazel tachlis hashlemus. That's now the completion, the complete picture. This is the ultimate harmony, the ultimate fulfillment that they actually receive from one another. And now he's applying this now to the eris and kelim that he's been discussing at length here. The same thing as in eris and kelim, there's these two types of hiskalilus, of interconnectivity, interconnection. The first is the general bittul, the general subjugation of energy and light, that it's in the form that it could manifest in containers. So it's already that's first one. It's a certain weakening of its essential personality. The bittul hakeli, and the same thing with the container. Container is the bittul of the container. That it should have within it that type of preparation and preparation, hachana, in order to receive energy. So that's type one, that they leave room for each other. So we're not yet talking about them joining completely, but we're talking about energy knows and senses that the bittul of the energy, in order that it has to go into and be manifest in containers, containers sense that they have to receive the energy. Should air and keli not have those two elements? Should the air not be ready to manifest? Should the container not be ready to receive? Then you have a war. There's no relationship. So this at least is a tolerance of, obviously earlier he talked more in Toyu and Tikkun. He was talking Eris and Kalim, so it's not like in Toyu with his, there's not going to be a relationship. So the first thing is they have to leave room for each other. Each one basically adapts or assumes through Bittul a little of the other, or ready to identify with the other. That may be the best way to put it. Yeah. That by the oil, the energy being transmitting in this form that has bittul, that is ready to manifest, it gives room that there's a container. The mere fact that the energy is ready to flow and transmit in a way that it will go into is giving room for that is giving space. It's recognizing the space of the container.
What does it mean? Nimshach Eifin Kazeh? It's Nimshach Elikli. It's Nimshach Elikli.
But Eifin Kazeh, that like he says, Sheyuchali is b'chinas eslapshas b'keim, that it's able to be able to be contained in containers. Yeah. Well, Kamoy Kain Hakeli al de'achon shla b'chinas bittul hayesh. The same thing the container through its preparation, like we spoke before about davening, or where a person breaks their own desires and turns themselves into a clay rekon, into an empty container. That works. That's work. By the container working on itself, preparing itself to bitla yesh, to sublimate its yeshes, its ego, its identity. That gives room, that leaves space, and that recognizes the value of the energy that it can manifest inside the container. That's step one in the hiskalilus. Rabbi, the second level, deeper level of interconnectivity, and the second is the level of bittul, of sublimation of the container that comes through the energy. Remember, we spoke in the previous chapter that the container, step one in the container has on its own bittul to receive. But that's still only bittul ayesh. Yichud Elah, the sense that there's nothing but the divine, comes from energy. And the air has it through hiskalilus. The Keli, has it through hiskalilus. Remember in the beginning of chapter 294, he said, it's only because it's submerged in the energy. Not because they have it on their own, but it's because they're encompassed and submerged in the energy. And because of the energy, that's how they have it. So now he's bringing this back now. So stage one is the container has something on its own, and the energy has something on its own. The energy on its own has the sense that it needs to descend, but its primary governing force factor and its overpowering feature is ayin. Yeah. The yesh, the keli, prepares itself to receive, but its primary thing is still yesh, but it's bittul yesh. So now you've laid the ground that both of them are ready for each other. Now comes the joining, and the joining is that the bittul of the container, now that it was ready to receive, now it receives a sense of something even higher. It would be like, as I said many times in different discussions, the first step is you have to show up. You have to show that you're receptive. Once you show you're receptive, then the transmitter will give you something you yourself would never have had on your own. So for the relationship to be complete, the first things you have to be there. And the more receptive you are, the more you'll be able to receive the higher bittul. And that's the bittul, that's Beis, the higher level of hiskalilus. The bittul of the kli, the sublimation of the container that comes through the energy, that this is the real bittul amiti. This is a true subjugation. The true subjugation is the bittul of yichud elah, which is that the above is the real yesh and below is ayin. In other words, that the true reality is above, which the container does not have on its own. Now, so you need really both elements. For the container, why can't you just have well, first of all, why do you need step one? For two reasons. Number one is step one makes it the container's experience. If there was just step two, just hypothetically, there was just step two,
just to give it over.
Right, it wouldn't be the containers. It wouldn't belong to the container. So it wouldn't really be an interface that would integrate. And the practical reason, obviously, is that if a container is not ready to show up to receive at all, it's not going to receive the power of the air altogether. So really, there's a practical reason and there's the deeper reason. The practical reason is you need step one, because two people arguing, let's say, if they don't show up and they don't tolerate each other, then you're not going to get any communication. You can't jump to a relationship without first tolerance. But the real reason for it is because then you'll own it also. Let's say someone hypothetically, miraculously can force two people to come together. But then it's a miracle. It's not that they really have a relationship. So this can't be coerced. You want the container to want it. So the container says, I want it. I'm coming here. I want your bittul. So that's already a level of bittul. And then once I want it, now give me what you have, what I don't have on my own. But that belongs to me now because I showed up. So you have here again the symbiotic, the interface working very beautifully, and they both retain their personalities. That's the key thing. We want to retain our personalities, but we want that personality to be able to adapt, assimilate a higher state of consciousness. And the higher state of consciousness is air, but you have to be receptive to it. And then you actually get a higher state of consciousness that the keli could never really have on its own.
Fantastic.
Huh?
Fantastic.
Yeah, and the same is the other way around. The air on its own is hiskalilus, but it has a sense that it has to join the container, has to bring that higher consciousness into the container. And then the container reveals in it a much deeper dimension of bittul, that this is really where it's supposed to be expressed, not just up there in the source, but down here in the parameters of existence. Okay, so that's been. Now he's going the other way around. Just like the bittul now we're on the second level, that the container now is a container for the higher bittul of the air. And the same thing is with the sublimation and setting aside of its own personality of the energy. In order for it to be able to manifest, completely get dressed up and manifest in the container to radiate within the container. So this too is the bittul amiti, a deeper bittul. And through this, by the air, which the container gives into the air, this causes the air to a radiation, a dimension of to radiate within the energy, a higher divine revelation, a higher level of air, a higher level of energy, which is the purpose that is wedged, that the beginning of it all, before the energy even began, is wedged in the containers. And this is the tikkun. This is the level. This is what means tikkun.
Just explain that again.
He said this before. Remember, he said that the container, you have the in the container is wedged the beginning, the purpose of it all, which is that things should come down into manifesting containers. This is what the container has. And the energy senses that. By manifesting the containers, it reveals the container, by being receptive to the energy, reveals that higher kavanah, the higher purpose, into the energy. So here too, just like the container has two stages. One, first it receives on its own, ready to receive, and then it gets the higher bittul from the air. Same thing with the air. The air senses on its own that it needs to go down. And when it's ready to do that, that bittul leads it to a deeper bittul that it's able to now really appreciate what's down there. So the keli teaches the air something, and the air teaches the keli something, but they both have to be receptive to each other. Remember, step one in hiskalilus is tolerance. They're both receptive to each other. The keli has to be receptive to the ayin, and the ayin has to be receptive to the yesh, so it's drawn down. And once they both do that, they both experience a higher level, and that's where the real hiskalilus takes place, the joining, the union. The keli assumes now and begins to experience this consciousness, the higher consciousness of the energy, and the energy now begins to appreciate the higher purpose of what God wanted it. Till now, it was more just because of its bittul. But the container teaches it that this is really the ultimate purpose beyond you. So both are experiencing fundamental bittul, and both join in the process. This is the meaning of the tikkun, the repair. The tikkun. Tikkun, fundamentally, this is a critical chapter here, because this is summing up the whole section here, is the bittul hiskalilus, the sublimation and the interconnectivity, hein ba'esas spheres, both within the 10 spheres in general, the hein ba'eres b'kelim b'chlal, and also in the general of the energy and containers. But Beis mina hiskalilus, the two types of hiskalilus, the two types of interconnectivity that we just learned. One, that they leave room for each other, they give room for each other, space for each other. And the second one, that they receive from one another. That's the ultimate fulfillment, the ultimate completion. And the inyan of this is commission is Baral El Perek Resh Ayin Gimel, like we learned before in chapter 273. Going back all the way to 273 now. Yeah, no, there's the B'kiyas HaKav, right? That what? Sheshakav Sharshim et Tiferes Hanelam, that the Kav, the ray of light that comes after the Tzimtzum, is rooted in the hidden Tiferes, which before the Tzimtzum, U'meprimis HaKeser, and from the inner dimension of Keser, V'inyanehu Lasis Hiskalilus. And its inyan, its purpose, its role, is to create this interconnectivity. Which means that it causes and creates this type of interconnectivity in the energies and containers and in the 10 spheres in both forms of hiskalilus. In chapter Resh Ayin Gimel, he was talking about, it was the end of the concept of the Metzach, about Shema. That was the Shema. So the basic theme there was that the energy before the Tzimtzum is Chesed Hanelam. Remember talking about the Esespheres Hagnuzis.
Yes.
The Tzimtzum is Gvura Hanelam, Hanelama. That's the will to reveal the Koyach HaGvul, the defined parameters of existence. And the Kav is from Tiferes Hanelam, higher than both of them. Yeah, Tiferes, and that's why, and its purpose is to connect, is to fuse the infinite and the finite. And all the scholars, he says, and all unity throughout the histalshelus, throughout the entire cosmic order, happens through this Kav. And that's the Shem and HaToiv, which is also part of the earlier discussion. So, I'm sorry? I'm going to read till the end here, through the Kitzur. We'll just go. Might as well. Because he's ending the mimer here now. Well, Pia now, according to the above, Yuvan is understood Masha Omer ben Rabbi, the Nasa v'Nishmei and Aderech Moshel base cases. He's understood what it says in Medrash Rabbi, which is the beginning of this mimer, that Nasa v'Nishma I will do, and then I will hear, or I will understand, is an example of two cups, base cases. Two cups. To listen, nasa v'nishma, is the bittul, person listening to the will. So there's a will, and he subjugates himself to this will. That's why it's called a cup, because a cup receives. That's the bittul of the keli to the air. The container's subjugations, receptivity to the energy. The rotzen b'chinas air v'nishma hu bittul hakeli air. So rotzen is the energy, and nishma means the container's bittul to the energy. Omnam nasa, but when you say I will do neidish zoh bittul the ein seif bal harotzen. I will do nishma is I will listen, I will understand. So it's the bittul to rotzen. The bittul of nasa is the bittul to ein sof bal harotzen, to the one who has the will, not just to the will itself, not just to the commandment, to the decree, but to the one who decrees. Last is kol mashiyah tzene, not just to do what he wants now, but to do whatever he wants. So nasa means I will do everything you want. Nishma, I will do this specific rotzen. It's also considered a cup. This is already a higher level. This is Hashem manas chalki v'kesi. Hashem gives us part of himself and his cup. This is the higher bittul he talked about. So it's the second cup. It's the second dimension of the cup, where the cup is a bittul to the air, and it assumes the bittul of the air. This is already the higher bittul, the bittul of Yichud Elah, which is true bittul. But Matan Torah, Nishma, and by Matan Torah they proceeded saying Nasa before Nishma. First we will do, and then we will understand, or first we will be bottled to the one who has, to the source, to the Balarotzen, and then to the Rotzen. Shayibem Bittul Kamei Mitzad Atzmus Ein Sof Balarotzen, because they had the bittul, how it is from Atzmus Ein Sof, which is the one who wills it all, the Balarotzen. Balarotzen means the owner of all the wills, which means the source of all will. Aval B'Chet Egel, after they sinned at the building of the golden calf, one second. So he says in the Medrash that by Matan Torah I poured you 2 cups, shivartim, but then you broke one, because through the building of the golden calf the tablets were broken. So then be careful in the nishma. You broke the nasa, the first one. So now be careful in the nishma and just listening to what I have to say. And he says, so now he's explaining this here, the shivartim. That when you'll be careful in the rotzen, in the lower bittul, you'll automatically come back to the higher bittul. So I gave you 2 cups, both of them. They had by Sinai itself, before the break of the tablets, before the sin, they had the higher level of bittul. But once they broke that cup, so to speak, so it says now be careful in the lower level. In other words, at least the bittul of the earth, the kli, be receptive, and then through that you'll get the higher bittul. And this is what was discussed in Perek Resh Tzadidal, chapter 294. Through the subjugation and the preparation of the container, that the container becomes empty and works on itself. Then it becomes ready to draw down the energy. And through the energy, it causes the container to have the bittul of the higher bittul of Yichud Ilah. This is what it means to hizru. Be careful in the nishma, and listen in the second, the nishma. Listen, be careful in having that bitla yesh and being receptive. And through that you'll come to the higher level of bitla, true bitla of nasa. which says in the pasuk where Hashem Moshe says to Rati, so now Jews, what is Hashem already asking for you? Ki'im liyira. He's not asking anything, just really that you should just have awe for him. And then afterwards, in that pasuk, in that verse, he counts on many things. What does this mean? That through the lower level of awe, lower level of awe, which is that you sublimate the yesh, your identity, your ego, that automatically brings you to the higher, all the higher levels of Bittul. Same thing is here in this verse, in this subject, through nishma, by being Bittul, at least to the will that he wants of you, brings you to the nasa, to be bottled to all of him. This is also what it says. This again is going back to the beginning of the discourse, to the. He's saying, God is saying to Jews, listen to me, because anyone that listens to me never loses. Will never fail, essentially. Like it says, Hashemeli Yishkin Botach V'Shanim. Those that listen to me will rest confidently and peacefully. So this is what it's been saying now. By listening to me, by having the bittul to me, you won't lose anything. On the contrary, it'll only add to you. Add oir. Because that's the listening. By your bittul of a yet layesh, that brings blessings to you. This is what it means. That listens to me, Yishkin will rest, will live in peace, will live confidently, betach, solidly, confidently, securely, and peacefully. The Isabei Rabba, it says in Zohar, Rabba Shainan la'atikim itmar. The word Shainan is referring to atikim, which is the primis akasa. And Hagili, the Prince Atzmas and Sof, Kavonis Li'itzis Haschala. That's the Gili, the revelation of Atzmas and Sof, which is the Kavana. That's where the higher purpose, the Kavana Olyena, is wedged in the beginning. This is also what it means, V'shanan Mefachid Ra, that this level of Shanan also Mefachid terrifies evil. Because from this level, you can't have any unikas achitzenim. Unikas achitzenim is when the negative energies wean energy. The begalim yachali yunika. When there's revelation, there's always the other side that comes and wants to have some for itself. When you have the higher level of bittul, God forbid, they're not capable of having any negative impact. But in order for there to be nishma, in order for there to be even the lower level of bitla yesh, you also have to have amshach l'mayla. You also have to have some strength from above. Like we learn in Priyatz Chaim, the kavanah of Krishma Shalamita, that we say before we go to sleep. Shema. That in order for Malchus to be a receptacle, an empty receptacle to contain, you need to have Hamshacha, a higher transmission from Radla, Reisha D'lo Yasad, which is Primis Akasa. We can say that this is what we've discussed earlier in chapter 277. The Bittul HaKelim Hu Ma'atzma Shema. That the Bittul of Kelim comes from the essence of Shema. And there we learned, we discussed, that that's the second level of connectivity that happens in the Kelim. Not the lower level, the higher level. And this is what it says in the verse, the blessing that you will listen to, the in order for there to be listening. So it's like as a bracha, the blessing that you will listen. You need a blessing in order for you to be a container. So you need a bracha v'amshachal mamayla. So it goes both ways. You need to be a container, bittul yesh, in order to get the higher bittul. But even bittul yesh needs also a blessing and some strength from above.
Yeah.
That's what he's adding here. And that's Asher Tishmu, Baruch Asher Tishmu, a blessing that you should be able to listen. In order for you to be able to listen, of this you need a blessing. The beginning, this is all Parsha A. That says, I give before you today the blessing. And the opposite, this is what it means. I give to you that you should have Bittul Primi V'atzmi, this internal and fundamental, essential Bittul, Shemitzad Etzem and Neshama, Hu Bittul Danasa. You should have it from the essence of your soul, and that's the higher Bittul of Nasa, not Nishma. And through this, we draw down the Primis Atzmus Einsev, the deepest and essential level of the divine, which is the ultimate purpose. But in order to get this higher Bittul, you first need to have the lower Bittul of Nishma. This is the meaning. Here, behold, I show you today. Because the ultimate purpose is that there should be the internal and essential bittul of the neshama. And the preparation for this is the bittul of nishma, the bittul of yesh. That yesh, the ego, is sublimated. And this is what it means, and this is the blessing that you will listen to. In order for there to be the shmiya, the listening, you need to have the blessing from above. And this brings us to nasa. This brings us to the higher level of bittul that comes from the essence of the soul, that reaches into the inner and essence of the divine. Kitzur. This is now the summary of the whole chapter. Omnam after we discussed that the container reveals, the container transfers to the energy, the sense of the higher purpose. He says that the truth is that also the energy on its own has bittul, has that sense of selflessness, the bittul, the sense being that it does descend. And the meaning of that is that its general transmission is in a way that it could possibly, it has the capacity and the potential to be manifest in containers. Because that's the higher purpose. And this is the ma'ayin liyesh of the Eir's general transmission. From ayin, from nothingness, from selflessness, to yesh, be manifest in the containers. Nevertheless, it's predominant, it's overpowering. It's a overpowering element. I'm trying to fully say b'tik beidus. Nevertheless, I'm trying to translate it right. Nevertheless, it is in its overwhelmingly nature of elevating. And through the containers, we get to placing yourself on a side. Placing your entire essence on a side by deshamachlifim tivim, and through the fact that they exchange their natures and they replace their natures, they change their natures. That's how they unite and fuse. We'll move on. And we understand that you can understand that in the areas of the energies in the containers have two types of interconnectivity. The bittul they have on their own. This is what leaves room for one another, tolerance. And the bittul that they create to one another is what they receive from one another. So they have something of their own, and then they receive something from one another. Ubezei yuvan, and this with this understand. I'm sorry, we'll understand the verse that we just learned. Behold, I show you today. Before I not show you. Behold, see how I give you today, or I give you before you. And Shabracha, the blessing Asher Tishma that you should listen to. Nishma Bittul Dachonis Akli. Nishma, to listen to, is the bittul of the preparation, the first bittul, the preparation of the container. V'nasu mitzad the b'chinas yichudi Allah. And nas is the higher bittul that comes from the energy yichudi Allah. V'zeu hizuru b'nishma. This is what it means. Be careful in the nishma. V'aydeizeh yiyeh gam ken b'chinas nasa. By being careful in the nishma, through this you'll also reach the nasa, the higher bittul. Or bittul aklei shem mitzadas mehu merad Allah. He says that even the bittul of its own, the fact that the keli on its own has bittul, also comes from a higher level of radlah. This is the bracha shetishma, and this means the bracha shetishma, the bracha that you should listen. So it's a bracha that gives you power to listen, to receive. Well, the fnechem, what is the meaning of the fnechem? He adds something that doesn't say in the inside. The fnechem means within you. That it should be an internal bittul, and that's the bittul pnimi of the higher level of the bittul of Yichud Lillah. With this we conclude chapter 295, which is the pages 566 through 568.